So Psalm 1, verse 1. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight, that man in verse 1, his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. The ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff which the wind driveth away. Therefore, the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. Verse 1 of chapter 2. Why do the heathen rage? And the people imagine a vain thing. The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointing, saying, let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh, and the Lord shall have them in derision. Then he shall speak to them in his wrath and vex them in his sore displeasure. Yet have I set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. I will declare the decree. The Lord hath said unto me, thou art my son. This day have I begotten thee. Ask of me, and I shall give thee for the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron. Thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Be wise now, therefore, O ye kings. Be instructed, ye judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and ye perish from the way, when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all they that put their trust in him. So, when we arrive here in the book of Psalms, the tendency is to treat it as 150 little snippets that are all separated from one another, that aren't necessarily related to one another. Kind of like how Proverbs is. Proverbs is got a bunch of different verses about a bunch of different things that, while some are related, not all of them, like one verse might be entirely related to the next verse, but the next verse might be completely different information and understanding because of the way the book of Proverbs is written. This book, however, is not like that. So when we come to the book of Psalms, we often segment it out, but we should realize that it's not entirely separate. Yes, there are sections within the book of Psalms, but it is connected. They are connected. We shouldn't discount the meaning of one psalm in regard to another psalm. As we've been reading through them, of course, each Sunday we read a psalm. And as we've been reading through many of them in the past, 10 or 15, we see the same themes being brought to the surface over and over and over and over again. The book of Psalms is almost like the Bible as a whole. The Bible as a whole is one book, but within one book, it has 66 separate books. Now, there's one purpose and one goal within the Bible, and one unique theme overarching all of them in the Bible. But when you get down to every little book, that book in and of itself has its own theme, if you will, that's getting us to the overarching goal. And within each book, there's, again, separated out for us, chapters and verses that they have their own little snippet of what to do, but again, it's all flowing together to reach the one theme, overarching theme. So, when we take the book of Psalms, we don't want to disconnect all the Psalms from one another. We want to realize that, hey, these are all put together for a reason and for a purpose. So they are interconnected. They are related, but we are still able to go to an individual psalm and jump into that psalm and understand what that individual psalm is teaching us. Now, the book of Psalms is broken down into 5 books. So within the book of Psalms, there's 5 books. It's possibly done this way to reflect the Torah. So the first 5 books of our Bible is what they would have referred to as the Torah, the law. And so it may be that Psalms was broken down into 5, kind of like how the Torah is broken down into 5. Not 100% sure on that, but the introduction of the book of Psalms is found in chapters 1 and 2. Chapters 3 through 41 are book 1, book 2, chapters 42 through 72, book 3, 73 through 89, book 4, 90 through 106, book 5, 107 to 145, and then the conclusion of the entire book is found in Psalms 146 through 150, the Hallelujah chorus, if you will. So, the next question then I want to raise is this: what does the book of Psalms intend to convey to us? What is the overarching theme that it wants us to grasp as we work through its pages and understand what is going on in there? I believe that is introduced for us within Psalms 1 and 2. Why would God preserve some of these things for thousands of years, 3,000 and 4,000 years, and maybe even more, for us? The first part of that purpose, I believe, is introduced in Psalm 1, and then the second part of the purpose, the application of the purpose, is found in Psalm 2. So, the first part is this: there are 2 paths that men can follow. One is a path of righteousness, which leads to life, or as the first word of chapter 1 says, blessedness, blessing. The second is a path of ungodliness, which leads to death, or the opposite of blessing, cursing. So then the second part, the connection, the application, is found in Psalm 2. Both life and death are granted by the Lord. But you get to choose whether you'll follow the path that leads to life or you're going to follow the path that leads to death. And throughout the rest of the Psalms, as you read Psalms 3 through 145, before you get to the conclusion of it, we see various psalmists: David, Asaph, the sons of Korah. Moses is thought to have written some of them. Some of them we have no idea who wrote them. But as we work through those psalms, what we see are righteous men, godly men, walking on this path of righteousness. They are the man from verse 1. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel. They're that righteous man that's attempting to walk in the blessings of God. And what we see is their struggles throughout their lives, and we see their high points, and we see their low points, and their ups and their downs all over the place. And so at times there's a massive mountain that they're standing on, and at times they're deep in the valley in depression and asking God, why are the righteous being persecuted, and why are sinners just wandering free and good to go without any implications to them? And other times it's, God, you're amazing and you've provided so greatly and wonderfully for us. And other times it's down in the depression again of, why is this happening to me? What did I do to deserve this? Ups and downs all over the place. We see the psalmist dealing with it. A summary, maybe, if you will, of the book of Psalms is put in Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8, which would be the most prominent psalmist, David, his son, writing Ecclesiastes, Solomon. Solomon, no doubt, inspired by his own life, writing the book of Ecclesiastes, but certainly with glimpses of his father's life, and his father's problems, and his father's dealings through life, in his mind as well. He wrote this in Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to get, a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away. A time to rend and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. And we see that throughout the book of Psalms, up and down, up and down. Times of great joy, times of deep depression, times of wondering why, and times of saying, it doesn't matter why, I'm going to rejoice either way. But when we boil all their experiences down, I believe we arrive at this moment where we can say that there are two paths that men can follow. One is a path of righteousness, which leads to life or blessing. One is a path of ungodliness, which leads to death or cursing. But both of them, both life and death, are given by the Lord. But you get to choose whether you're going to follow a path that leads to life or a path that leads to death. So, with that background, number one, we have a comparison between the two paths. A comparison between the two paths. Now, we don't know who wrote chapters 1 and 2 of the book of Psalms. There's plenty of men that have made their thoughts and wonders about who did, and some speculate David, some speculate other people, but we don't really know. We don't have any idea for sure. But whoever did write Psalms 1 and 2, they had a fascinating insight into God and into human life. Or they were given by God this insight into human life. My guess is that the person that wrote this was an elderly man. Someone who had lived life, who'd seen life, who'd gone through life. And he could look back on his life, he could look on his children's lives, maybe his grandchildren's lives, maybe great-grandchildren's lives, his friends from college, not that they had college necessarily, but his friends from growing up, his enemies from growing up, his enemies while he was an adult. He could look back on all this array of everything in front of him from his past, and he could look at that and he could pen under the inspiration of the Spirit, some of these people were blessed and some of these people refused the blessing. Some of the people went this way and other people went this way. My one son went this way, my other son went this way, and we can see how the paths took them. So, my guess is that the person writing this is an elderly man that's able to speak with a wisdom that youth just doesn't quite grasp. Not to discount youth, but I couldn't write this because I wouldn't fully understand that at my age. I'm 31. I'm not nearly as wise and understanding as most everybody in this room. So you guys have a better perspective on life in the past than I do. Now, someday when I get to be the ripe old age of 98 and I look back on life, I'll have a different perspective of the paths this person went, the paths each of my children went, and everything like that. So that's my guess as to who wrote it. An elderly man. Maybe if I was forced to put a name to it, I'd guess maybe Moses, having seen all that he had seen and how he had walked, but again, we don't know. The author first introduces to us, in this comparison of the two paths, the path of righteous, the path of the righteous path, if you will. He says in verse 1, "Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper." Of course, the first word there is blessed, blessing, indicating an opposite sign. If one is not blessed, one is cursed. The path of the ungodly would be the one that is cursed, or the absence of blessing if you don't like that it's cursed. The word blessed here means happy. Now, our modern understanding of the word happy doesn't really encapsulate it, because we think of happiness is just a fleeting thing. It comes and it goes up and it goes down. If at this point I'm happy and this point I'm sad, and so happiness goes up and down. But the fullest implication of this word blessed is a consistency of happiness. Joy is what we would say it as. The path of the righteous person leads to a state of something that does not change, no matter the circumstances. Now, it's going to lead more than just to a state of joy, because verse 3 is going to explain more what it's going to lead to, but for this moment, blessed is the man, so happy is the man, joyful is the man that does not do these three things. And we'll get to those here in a moment. So if the righteous man then does not walk in the counsel of the ungodly, if he does not stand in the way of sinners, and if he doesn't sit in the seat of the scornful, then the obvious question would be, what does he do? And of course, that's answered for us in verse 2. His delight, his meditation is the law of the Lord, both day and night. Not that he's bipolar, he does it at all times. Now, we often refer to the Bible as the law of the Lord. And of course, as I said before, in those days it would have been the Torah. The law is what they would have called the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Try to combine both of them there. So, it's not necessarily that the righteous man delights in the Bible itself, but rather, it's that the righteous man delights in obeying the directions and instructions found within the Bible. So, yes, I am glad I have the Bible, and I have a Bible. But it's not just the book that I delight in. The delight is found when you understand the words of the Bible, and then you take those words and do them. They mean something to you. They affect your life. That's what he's meditating in. That's what he's delighting in. In fact, there's a unique similarity between verses 2 and 3 of Psalm 1 and Joshua 1. In Joshua 1, the Lord speaks to Joshua after the death of Moses. And there's some backstory behind it, but we're going to jump down to verse 7. And the Lord tells Joshua, he says, "Only be thou strong and very courageous, that thou mayest observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded thee. Turn not from it to the right hand or to the left, that thou mayest prosper whithersoever thou goest." Then in verse 8 he says, "This book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night, that thou mayest observe to do according to all that is written therein. For then thou shalt make thy way prosperous, and then thou shalt have good success." See, by the righteous man's obedience, by what the blessed is the man in verse 1, that man, because he delights in the law of the Lord and meditates in the law of the Lord, because that's where it is, verse 3 says he will become like a tree planted in the water. And of course, Joshua says that person will be prosperous and successful. And of course, that's ended at verse 3 as well. So it's not that he's in the water. The blessed man is not necessarily in the water, because if he were in the water, he would be drowned out by the water. But he's by the water, where he can gain from the water. And he's not so far away from the water that he has to rely on another source to give him the water, but rather he's by the water. The roots are able to extend out and gather water as is needed for the soul. Thus, with the proper intake of water, that tree then produces the proper fruit, the best fruit. At the right time, with the right quality, in his season. It says, "His leaf also shall not wither." In other words, because the tree has access to water properly and as much as it needs without having too much, the leaves aren't going to wither and they're not going to look sickly. They're going to gather the nutrients that they need as they need them. So, because of the righteous man's obedience to the Lord, the psalmist then just concludes and he says, "And whatsoever he doeth shall prosper." It's almost as though he says, this is logical. It has to happen. Because this man delights in the law of the Lord, because he meditates, and because he's planted by the rivers of the water, he has to prosper. It's almost like there's a thing that it's not possible that he could not prosper because of doing this thing. Now, the prosperity, of course, becomes what kind of prosperity is it? And of course, it's not prosperity how we think of prosperity. We think of prosperity as, oh, how much money do you have? How much land do you own? How much stuff do you have? That's not the prosperity. Jesus' teaching on prosperity would not be how much of that you have, but rather, where's your treasure? Jesus' idea of prosperity would be more on the lines of, well, yeah, that person's prospering because look at all the treasure he has waiting for him in heaven. not here on earth. So, that is the first path. Now, the second path is the path of the ungodly. When we compare the path of the ungodly to the path of the righteous, the writer doesn't restate verse 1. He just starts in verse 4 with the ungodly are not so, meaning they're not like the tree. They're opposite of the tree. In fact, they're obviously the ones that do the things in verse 1 and don't do the things of verse 2. They are the ones that walk in the counsel of the ungodly. The path of the ungodly is ones that they do stand in the way of sinners, and they do sit in the seat of the scornful. We get a picture from that of kind of a vicious cycle, if you will. A repetition over and over and over and over again, where one person stands in the seat of the walks in the counsel of the ungodly, and then his son walks in the counsel of the ungodly, and his son follows, and his son, and his son, and his son, and down the line you go, where there's just this continual repetition of people following in this life, and in this way of doing things. It's almost how we might state it is doing the exact same thing, expecting different results from doing it. The ungodly man doesn't go to the law of the Lord to find his direction and instructions. Rather, he goes to the ungodly, and he says, from them, he says, what should I be doing? What do I need to do? And the ungodly person says things like, do whatever makes you feel good, whatever makes you happy. Live your best life now. Make as much money as you can, go on as many vacations as you can, party as much as you can. You only live once. The phrase YOLO, you only live once. So make it count for whatever you want. So the author says they're not so. They're not like the righteous man. Instead of delighting in the obedience to the law of the Lord, the ungodly man walks in the counsel of God. He stands in the way of sinners. He sits in the seat of scornful. That's where he finds his delight. He finds his delight doing the things that sinners do. Sin. He finds his delight in doing wrong things. He also finds his delight in the seat of the scornful, those that would criticize the righteous man for not doing the things that they're doing. And thus the author, just as he did with the righteous man, illustrates the problem that arises when the ungodly man does those things. When the ungodly man does those things, he becomes like the chaff which the wind driveth away. Therefore, he won't be able to stand in the judgment, nor sinners in this congregation of the righteous. So, the illustration of the chaff I've used before, and there's different ways to do it, but the chaff, again, is the outer shell of a piece of grain. The chaff is useless. It blows away within the wind. It has no taste. It just needs to be gotten rid of. You don't want the chaff, you want the grain. Because the chaff is very lightweight, it easily is blown by the wind. So when you take the chaff off of the grain, they would put their threshing floors on tops of hills in those days, because that's where the wind came through. And as they would grind out the chaff and get the grain, the wind would blow through and it would pick up the chaff and blow it away because it was very lightweight. And then the wind drove the chaff. So one piece of chaff would go over here, and one would just wander over here, and one would fly 150 miles away out into the Mediterranean Sea. Just wherever. That's what the unrighteous man is like. The ungodly man. He's not delighting in the law of the Lord. Instead, he's just going here, wandering there, wandering here, because there is no direction. There is no guidance. Truly, anyway. He goes wherever his counselors go. He goes wherever sinners go, and he goes wherever the scorner is. And we can see this taking place in our world today. Whereas the ungodly 100 years ago would never have put up with and endorsed the ungodliness of today. They would have looked at it and said, oh no, you can't do that. Not that they necessarily would have said that it was sinful, them too being unsaved, but they would look at it and say, oh, well, you can't legalize that. Oh, you can't do that. But here today, they've been driven by the wind, and so they're going whichever way the ungodly wants to go. And we could go into examples of that over and over and down the line. The obvious end of this person that has no direction and is just following the ungodly people all around, the obvious end of that person is that they're going to be unable to stand in the judgment, he says. They won't be able to stand, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. Why can that person not stand? Because they have nothing to stand on. See, the righteous man, having followed the direction of the Scriptures that the Lord gave, the delighting in the law of the Lord, because the righteous man does those things, he's not going to be standing on his own power. He's going to be standing under the power of the one whom he followed. He's going to be standing under the power of this book that he followed. The Lord who died and gave himself for that man, he's the one that's going to prop up that man. He's the one that's going to cause that man to stand. Because every man, woman, boy, and girl will stand before the judgment someday. Some are going to stand there, and they're going to be righteous. And they're going to stand on the fact that they place their faith in Jesus, in His blood, in His broken body for them. And they're going to stand, and others are not going to be able to stand because they refuse to put their faith in that God. And they said, no, I'm going to do whatever the ungodly man wants me to do. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to go here, and I'm going to be blown there, and I'm going to do those things. So then the question we might ask at that point is, will you be able to stand in the judgment? When the judgment comes, as it's going to do, will you be able to stand? Have you put your faith in Christ? Or are you following the ungodly man? Are you putting your faith in them and yourselves and just being driven wherever you want? Verse 6 concludes with, the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. It's not that He doesn't know the way of the ungodly, but rather, He knows the way of the righteous. He knows where they're going to end up. He knows the way of the ungodly, and He knows where they're going to end up. It's almost as if we were able to zoom out on life, and we were able to watch two people from the time they were born to the time that they died. And we were able to watch them and see this man going this way on this path, and this man going this way on this path. And we were able to compare them and see their beginning and their end, and one will end up in eternity with life, and one will end up in eternity of death. The author wants us to see, as we open this book, as we are opening the Psalms, there's two paths that we can choose in life. There's two ways which we can go. And so we should stop and examine ourselves and ask the question, what path am I on? Who am I in this psalm? Which man am I? Am I the man that is blessed because I delight in the law of the Lord? Or am I the man that is going to be cursed because I'm following every wind of doctrine, every ungodly move? Now, many would stop right there and break Psalm 1 and 2. And that's okay. I'm not downing that by any means. But Psalm 2, I believe, connects in with Psalm 1. These two psalms are so connected that many times in the past, some within the church only consider there to be 149 psalms, not 150, because they combined Psalms 1 and 2 as one particular unit. Which leads us to number 2, a choice between the two paths. So first he compares the two paths for us, and then we're provided with a choice. He first introduces this question. In light of the comparison of the righteous and the ungodly, the author says this: why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against His anointed, saying, let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. So he said, if those are the two paths, righteousness and ungodliness, why are the heathen, why are the ungodly so upset about this? Why are they so upset that the author says this man is going to be blessed and this man is going to be cursed? This man is going to live and this man is going to perish. Why are they so upset about this? Well, one reason he addresses is that they think they are being held back by the Lord and His anointed. Thus they say, we got to break them off of us. These righteous people, we need to break them off. They're holding us back. And it is true that the influence of Christians within a society to withhold and keep back the judgment and wrath of God, that is true. However, the complaint in here that's saying, let's do these things, let's cast off these cords, they think that the righteous person are in their God are binding them. They're keeping them, the fun police, if you will. They're not allowing us to do this, and they don't want us to kill all the babies, and they don't want us to go do whatever we want with whomever we want, wherever we want, and however we want, and in front of whomever we want. They don't want us to do all that. They don't want us to have fun. They don't want us to enjoy life to the best. So they say, let's break the bands. Let's get out of this prison, this God and His anointed that are oppressing us. Let's break out of this prison so we can do whatever we want. Every man does that which is right in his own eyes, is what they want. So they look at Christ, and they look at God, and they say, the yoke of God is so oppressive and hard. He says, don't do this, and don't do that, and don't do this, and don't do that. And we don't want that. We want an easy burden, an easy yoke. So we got to get rid of His yoke. In reality, though, they've missed it. Because the yoke of God is easy. His burden is light. And they don't realize that the yoke of sin is heavy and will cause them to perish. Spurgeon said it this way. He said, to a graceless neck, the unsaved man, the yoke of Christ is intolerable, but to the saved sinner it is easy and light. We may judge ourselves by this. Do we love that yoke, or do we wish to cast it from us? So, that's what they want to do. That's why the heathen are raging. That's why the people imagine a vain thing, because they don't want this God to oppress them, or so they think. And of course, God's response to that is, in verse 4 through 6, He says, he that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. Then He shall speak to them in His wrath, and vex them in His sore displeasure. The irony of making the decision to say, we're going to cast off God. We need to just get God out of our society. We need to stop using the morals of the Bible and what God has established. We just need to get that gone and establish our own kind of morality in the world. Yet, failing to see, God knows their path. God knows what they're going to do. He just said it in Psalm 1. So they think if we could just cast off God, that'd be great. But God laughs at that because you can't cast off God. He's omnipotent. He knows everything. He sees everything. He's everywhere. And they think for some reason, maybe we could just cast this God off. He says He'll have them in derision. That means to mock or ridicule. In other words, their decision to try and cast off God and expel the Christians, the righteous people from society, their decision to do that is so foolish and unwise, it is worthy of being laughed at and mocked and ridiculed because of its impossibility. But not only does God laugh and mock them, He does so because He's angry. His wrath. And so we might say, well, why would He be angry and wrathful? Because they rejected His Son. They're not delighting in the law of the Lord. They've rejected that. They've said, no, we don't want that. We want to do what we want to do. We want to follow the counsel of the other ungodly. We want to stand in the way of sinners. We want to sit in the seat of the scornful. We don't want your religion. We don't want your Christ. They pushed the Son away. They said, no, we don't want Jesus. And this angers God because they've rejected His Son. There is no salvation for them apart from the Son. Thus, if they reject the Son, the only thing they can face is God's wrath. Then in verse 6 he says this, Yet have I set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. This is God the Father speaking. The kings and rulers, back in verse 2, the kings of earth and the rulers, they're simply a display of the people. It's not that the kings and rulers were necessarily operating separate from the people. They were all together, but these kings and rulers were the ones leading this charge. And they were going to be held accountable for the people's actions. Now, he says, yet have I set my king in my holy hill of Zion. So, in other words, lest these kings and rulers think somehow they do have the power to cast off this God and rid God from their society, lest they think they can actually do that, God reminds them, by the way, I put my king up. You call yourselves kings, but the king is on the throne. Jesus, the king, has been set up, also known as Jerusalem, that word Zion. So no matter what these wicked men attempt to do or try to do, he says, Christ is reigning. He's on the throne. It doesn't matter what you try and do. Stephen Lawson says this. He said, this declaration speaks first to the present enthronement of Christ at the right hand of God, following his ascension, bestowing upon him the place of highest privilege and authority. That's in Psalms 110, Acts 2. Ultimately, these words that my king has been established in Zion, ultimately, these words anticipate the return of Christ to earth and his glorious enthronement during his 1,000-year reign from Jerusalem. So now we have a messianic psalm telling us of things that are going to come in the future. So he says this, my king is established. Now, in verse 7 down through verse 9, we have a slight shift. Because no longer is necessarily God the Father speaking in this psalm. So God the Father is the one that said, I have set up my king. But now in verse 7, the author, writing under inspiration, is writing from the perspective of Jesus the king. When Jesus the king is saying this, and he says these words, I will declare the decree. The Lord has said unto me, thou art my son. So that's where we understand, oh, this is Jesus speaking. So God the Father gave a decree to Jesus, and he said this, thou art my son. This day have I begotten thee. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron, thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. So, it was and is ridiculous for the ungodly to think, oh, we can just get rid of God. We can cast him off. We can get rid of the Christians. Let's kill them all and get them out of our society. It's ridiculous to think that you can do that because Jesus is already the king. He is the Son of God. Thou art my son. He also says, this day have I begotten thee, Jesus. He's the begotten one of God, the chosen of God. And he says, ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thy inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. Remind us of Jesus being tempted by Satan. When Satan says, takes him up to the top of the temple and says, hey, any of these things, or the high mountain, and says, look at the kingdoms of the earth. I have all these. I can give them to you. And God the Father says, no, I can give these things to you. Because this king is so powerful and mighty, that though the ungodly would desire to break God off of them, to break those bands, to cast away the cords, the irony is found here in verse 9, where he says, no, thou, Jesus, you're the one that's going to break them. They're going to try and break you off of them, but in reality, you're the one that will break them. They will bow to you. He says, you will shatter them in pieces like a potter's vessel. So with all that in mind, the author comes back in verse 10 and makes this statement. He says, be wise now, therefore. Therefore, in light of who the true king is, Jesus, this one that's been established by God, don't make a rash decision. Don't reject this king like you want to. Be wise now. O ye kings. Be instructed, ye judges of earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and ye perish from the way, when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all they that put their trust in him. See, the author now calls the ungodly men, the kings and rulers included, the people, the heathen that are raging, the people that are imagining vain thing. He calls them and he says, hey, this is what you need to do. You need to make a choice. You want to cast off that God, but that decision's worthy of being ridiculed. Instead, look at who God is. Look at who the true king is. So now, because you see who the true king is, use wisdom and instruction to make your decision. Don't foolishly run into the counsel of the ungodly who says, yeah, let's cast off those bonds. Let's get rid of that man. We're sinners. Let's do whatever we want. He says, no. Stop and consider who he is. Turn from how you behave. Serve the Lord with fear. Not fear as in, and I'm afraid, but fear as in awe and wonder and respect of who this God is. He's holy, he's mighty, he's the king, so serve him with fear. Don't serve yourselves. Don't rush to follow the counsel of the ungodly that encourages you to do whatever, but do what makes the king happy. Serve him. Rejoice with trembling for him. And then he says in verse 12, kiss the Son, which is somewhat strange, sudden to our ears, but it brings the illustration to mind of back when the time of kings and queens and stuff like that. It may still be practiced by some nations, I suppose, but when you come before the king, you would bow down and you'd take the king's hand and you'd kiss the king's hand, showing that I am low, you are holy. Showing I'm respecting you, I'm giving reverence to who you are, king. I am nobody, but you are the king. So you kiss the Son, you kiss the hand of the king to show I'm loyal to you. I'm showing you respect. I'm bowing down before you. But if you came to the king and refused to do that, that was a sign of your reverence. And many of the kings would have you executed for not showing the proper reverence to them. So the author encourages them and says, kiss the Son. Kiss the real king. Bow to that king in reverence. See, I have said this before 1,000 times probably. Once you see who you are in relation to who he is, you realize, oh, wow, what a king. So if you refuse to kiss the Son, the king then has every right to be angry. So back in those days, if you refuse to give the king the honor he was due, whether you agreed with the king or not, if you refused to give the king the honor he was due, they could have you executed. And he says here, kiss the Son, lest he be angry. Show him you respect him. If you refuse to do that, rightfully the king is going to be angry and you'll perish, he even says. On the other hand, as he finishes chapter 12, or verse 12 of chapter 2, he kind of harkens back to the beginning of Psalm 1. And he says, blessed are all they that put their trust in him. They truly worship the one. They're the ones who bowed to the king. They served the Lord with fear. They rejoiced with trembling. They kissed the Son. Blessed are they that put their trust in him. So this goes back to the original statement I gave you. There are two paths that men can follow. One path is righteousness. And that path is going to lead down a road that will lead to life, eternal life, blessing. The other path, the path of ungodliness, is the path that will lead to death. Those that follow that path will be cursed, banished to an eternity separated from God in hell. But here's the thing. Both life and death are granted by the Lord. So you get to choose. Do I want to follow the path of life, delighting in the law of the Lord, following the law of the Lord? Or do I want to follow the path that leads to death, the ungodly path? The one where I follow the counsel of the ungodly and stand in the way of sinners, do what sinners do. So the question today is simply this. What are you going to choose? The path of righteousness that leads to eternal life, or the path of ungodliness, which is going to lead to eternal death? So when we examine the Psalms, and as we open the book of Psalms, and I know we're only spending 4 weeks in the book of Psalms, but as we go through the Psalms, as we read one each week, consider the author's perspective and point of view. As he goes through there and says, oh, there's only two paths. And as each author continues along the line, I mean, if we were to go back to Psalm 39 that we read this morning and read it and see David on the path of righteousness dealing with what he's dealing with, the desire to speak up against them, the desire to realize, and he even does in Psalm 39, realizing my life is but a vapor, my life is nothing. But then he says, my hope is in thee. I'm not waiting for anything here. My hope is in you, God. So as we examine the Psalms and as we read a psalm each week, consider the beginning, the introduction to the Psalms, that each psalm is pointing back to this thought that there are only two paths and there are only two people, as I've stated numerous different times. So which path are you going to choose? Let's pray.